In the quiet corners of countless homes and atop the polished shelves of funeral parlors, there rested urns that seemed harmless, reverent even, symbols of closure and memory. Yet behind their stillness was a silence that disturbed the saints. Padre Pio had long sensed it, not the silence of mourning, but the hollow silence that followed a decision made without full understanding. To many, cremation was just a choice, a practical end to earthly remains. But to those attuned to spiritual truths, like Sister Lucia and Padre Pio, it was a door that could swing open in the wrong direction. For centuries, the Church upheld the burial of the body in sacred ground, not simply as tradition, but as a testament of belief in the resurrection of the body. The body, made in God's image, was not mere matter to be reduced to ash, but a vessel touched by the sacraments, destined for reunion with the soul at the last day. Sister Lucia, in her later years, spent long evenings in prayer, her hands moving, through rosary beads worn smooth with time. She had seen too much to remain unmoved. Whispers of families keeping urns on mantels, of ashes divided among relatives or transformed into jewelry. These acts unsettled her spirit. There was a sacredness that had been forgotten, not because the ashes themselves were evil, but because the intention behind how they were treated had shifted. It had become about memory without mystery, about presence without prayer. Padre Pio, too, encountered this change. When visitors brought urns for blessings, some recalled how his demeanor would subtly alter. He would fall into quiet contemplation or gently turn them away with a grave expression. He did not condemn those who chose cremation out of necessity or ignorance, but he warned of the spiritual detachment that often accompanied it. The body, he once said in a private letter, was like a lamp once filled with the oil of grace. To scatter it without reverence was to forget the light it once carried. In one small village, a young widow had kept her husband's urn beside their wedding photo. The couple had been devout, but in her grief, she'd chosen what seemed simpler. Soon, strange patterns unfolded in her home. Restless nights, inexplicable, tension, and unshakable chill. She visited the monastery and asked Padre Pio for advice. He listened, and after a moment of prayer, gently asked, "Where have you placed him?" She answered, and his silence said enough. He instructed her to have the remains transferred to blessed ground, not for superstition, but for peace. Days later she returned, transformed. The heaviness had lifted. These were not isolated stories. Time and again it became clear that ashes unblessed, urns unguarded, and remains kept without prayer had consequences that rippled through families and faith. Lucia and Pio both knew. The Church does not bind in fear but frees through wisdom. And this wisdom taught them. Ashes may cool, but what they carried, grace or grief, did not simply disappear. In the quiet cloisters of her Carmelite convent, Sister Lucia of Fatima carried a burden far heavier than her aging frame might suggest. Though the world remembered her as the last living seer of the 1917 apparitions, her silence in later decades often raised more questions than answers. She had seen the secrets of heaven and the strategies of hell. And among the many revelations entrusted to her heart, there was one that clung to her spirit like incense in the folds of her habit. A truth about the dignity of the human body and the consequences of forgetting it. Lucia had long believed that the modern world was drifting not only from faith, but from reverence. She watched with sorrow as even devout Catholics, out of convenience or cultural pressure, began to choose practices that quietly undermined centuries of sacred teaching. Cremation, once a rarity, was now common. The practice itself was no longer forbidden outright by the Church. But Lucia knew that with its spread came a growing detachment from the sacred meaning of the human body. She understood that the permission to cremate was given in mercy, not as an encouragement. She wrote often, especially in her later years, filling pages with reflections, warnings, and urgent appeals for deeper understanding of the spiritual world. Among these writings were meditations on the body as a temple and on the subtle dangers of reducing it to ashes without reverent intention. But not all her words reached the public. Her letters were read, filtered, and in some cases, quietly, stored away. The hierarchy surrounding her was cautious. Her experiences with heaven had always commanded awe, but now that she was no longer a child with visions, her insights, especially those that called for uncomfortable changes, were received with silence. Visitors who came to see her behind the convent grate reported moments of profound intensity. Lucia's eyes, aged yet unwavering, would sometimes linger too long on questions that seemed innocent. When asked about the end times, or about how the Church should handle modern spiritual confusion, she would pause, not out of forgetfulness, but discernment. She had seen what happened when divine warnings were ignored or diluted. She had lived through decades of slow erosion, prayers replaced by programs, ritual replaced by routine. One nun recalled how Lucia once wept silently during evening prayer, after receiving a letter describing a family that had split the ashes of their mother into keepsake jewelry. Though she said nothing, her tears spoke volumes. She believed that when the body was no longer treated as sacred, the soul's memory on earth was fractured. It wasn't about punishment, it was about spiritual integrity, about maintaining the line between heaven's order and earth's disorder. Lucia never sought fame, and perhaps that is why heaven entrusted her with so much. Yet those around her often misunderstood this humility for compliance. She did not fight when her writings were delayed or her voice softened by the caution of church authorities. But in the silence, she entrusted everything to prayer. She would rise before dawn, kneel before the tabernacle, and speak the things she was not allowed to publish. She gave them to God and to the angels who never forgot. Years later, after her death, fragments of her writing surfaced, passages that had been tucked away, marked sensitive or not for publication. In them were references to the mystery of the body's final rest, the spiritual residue of how we treat the dead, and a call for reconsecration of human remains when reverence had been lost. These words were not harsh. They were sorrowful, urgent, full of motherly concern for souls who did not understand what was at stake. Lucia had not been silenced by malice, but by a fear that the truth she bore might disturb the comfort of the faithful. Yet she knew the greater danger lay in a church that forgot how to mourn rightly, how to bury with hope, and how to honor even dust as the beginning of eternity. In the dim light of the confessional corridor in San Giovanni Rotondo, Padre Pio's presence was unmistakable. Even when he sat in silence, the weight of his discernment seemed to fill the space. Over the years, many pilgrims arrived bearing gifts and sacramentals to be blessed: rosaries, scapulars, crucifixes. Among them, increasingly, were urns, small, ornate, heavy with memory. They were held out with trembling hands, often accompanied by hopeful eyes and whispered pleas. But Padre Pio's reaction was always the same, gentle, yet immovable. He would not raise his hand. He would not whisper a blessing. Instead, he would slowly shake his head and, in rare moments, utter words that pierced deeper than silence. This was not meant to be this way. For those who asked why, he never launched into theological lectures or debates. He simply turned his gaze downward, as if burdened by a sorrow that words could not relieve. Padre Pio's reluctance was not rooted in judgment of souls. He had heard confessions for hours, peering into the hearts of murderers and saints alike. He knew mercy, but he also knew the invisible realm more intimately than most. He could sense what lingered in objects, what clung to spaces, what disrupted peace. His gift was not only to see, but to feel, the spiritual residue of choices made without knowledge, the confusion of intentions, and the wounds left by disordered reverence. The urns, to him, carried not only ashes but a spiritual dissonance. They symbolized a world slowly detaching from the theology of the body, from the hope of the resurrection, and from the sacred order of burial passed down through the centuries. In traditional burial, there is an act of entrusting, a laying to rest in the earth with the full knowledge that the body is not discarded, but sleeping, awaiting the final trumpet. Cremation, though not inherently sinful, often bypassed this symbolic surrender. And the urns, placed on mantles, divided among family, stored in closets, turned that sacred sleep into something unresolved. Padre Pio had read the signs of the times. He had visions of a church under siege, not just from the outside, but from within, from forgetfulness, from modern comforts that dulled spiritual truths. He saw the faith becoming cosmetic, sentimental, increasingly removed from sacrifice. And in these urns he saw evidence of a culture growing more afraid of death, not in its physical horror, but in its spiritual finality. Cremation, in the way it was being adopted, often reflected an attempt to neutralize death, to tidy it, to store it out of sight without confronting its eternal consequence. One friar remembered a woman who had traveled from Milan to seek Padre Pio's blessing over the ashes of her brother. She wept as she opened the ornate container, explaining how her brother had lost his faith but returned to prayer in his final days. She wanted his remains blessed, sanctified. But Padre Pio did not move. He bowed his head, closed his eyes, and after a long pause said, "Your prayers for his soul are worth more than what this holds." Then he handed her a crucifix and urged her to pray the Divine Mercy chaplet every day. His concern was never about appearances. It was always about the soul. He believed that when something becomes common, it risks becoming casual. And when the body, through which sacraments were received, penance made, the Eucharist consumed, is reduced to ashes and held as decoration, even unintentionally, it creates a fracture in the reverence owed to God's creation. Many who received his refusal felt confusion, even offense. Some left San Giovanni Rotondo in silence, others in tears. But a few, over time, came to understand. They returned home and quietly chose to enter the urns in sacred ground, to have masses said, to establish a place of rest and prayer. In doing so, they witnessed a change, not only in the spiritual atmosphere of their homes, but in their own hearts. The burden of grief became less chaotic, the memories more peaceful, the mourning more sacred. Padre Pio never condemned cremation outright. He was not there to lecture, only to guide. But he believed deeply in the symbolism of burial, the return to earth, the waiting in silence, the echo of Christ's tomb. His refusal to bless urns was not an act of judgment, but a prophetic protest against the slow erosion of mystery. He saw the body not merely as flesh, but as a vessel of divine history, a vessel that deserved to be returned, not preserved like a relic, but released like a promise. And in that silent refusal, he offered the world a lesson it did not want, but deeply needed. To remember that the ashes we keep are not the end, and that reverence does not belong to convenience, but to truth. In the quiet corners of homes across the world, urns rested silently on shelves, atop mantels, or tucked into drawers. They were often framed with candles, flowers, or family photographs, small altars of remembrance constructed in grief and love. But what many didn't realize was that beneath this reverence, something subtle was shifting, something spiritual and largely unseen. Padre Pio and Sister Lucia had both, in their own ways, pointed to the danger not of fire, but of forgetfulness. And it was this forgetfulness that had opened the door to a deeper pain than most dared acknowledge. The Church, in her mercy, had made room for cremation under specific conditions, understanding that not all lands offered the space or means for burial. But with this permission came a warning that the body must still be treated with the dignity owed to a temple of the Holy Spirit, and that the ashes should be interred, not kept, scattered, or divided like relics. This part was often ignored or misunderstood. Families clinging to the nearness of what remained held on to the ashes as if love could delay eternity. But spiritual laws, like natural ones, are not suspended by sentiment. Padre Pio had seen what others could not. He witnessed how the improper handling of remains affected not only the dead, but the living. In confessionals, he heard cries of anxiety, insomnia, strange tensions within households. He noticed patterns. Homes where ashes were kept often carried a spiritual heaviness. He never blamed the grieving. He wept with them. But he warned them that certain actions, no matter how well-meaning, invited unrest. The human soul is attuned to the sacred, and when sacred order is broken, that unrest echoes silently. Sister Lucia, too, had written letters, most of them buried in archives or tucked away in Vatican vaults, where she hinted at the spiritual disorientation that arises when death is no longer approached through the lens of eternity. She did not write against cremation outright, but she mourned how easily it became an act of closure instead of surrender. She feared a time when people would seal their loved ones into decorative urns and call it peace, while their prayers for the departed ceased, and their connection to the communion of saints dimmed. To her, the greatest error was not cremation itself, but what followed, forgetting that the dead need prayer, and that the living need to let go. In numerous cases reported by exorcists and spiritual directors, homes holding human ashes, especially those scattered or kept contrary to church guidance, exhibited strange disturbances. Children experiencing nightmares, marriages falling into inexplicable strain, objects breaking without cause, a persistent atmosphere of sorrow that refused to lift. And when asked, these homes often revealed the same secret. We didn't know where else to keep them. What was meant as a gesture of closeness had unknowingly invited something else. Padre Pio believed that spiritual disorder breeds confusion and grief. He often said, when the natural law is respected, grace flows more freely. But when burial became privatized, when urns became symbols of resistance to letting go, something of that grace was blocked. He likened it to a wound that couldn't scab, because it was reopened each day. The soul of the departed may already be in the hands of God, but the living needed ritual, closure, surrender. Without it, they wandered in an invisible grief that never found rest. The pain that came through these doors was not punishment, it was consequence. A spiritual law ignored does not result in God's wrath, but in spiritual imbalance. The presence of ashes in places not meant to hold them did not summon evil, but it held the door open to despair, to stagnation, to subtle torment. It kept grief alive in ways it was not meant to be kept. The living remained tethered to death, unable to fully mourn, unable to fully move forward. But this pain could be healed. Padre Pio often encouraged those who came to him with such burdens to do what they had not done, to bring the ashes to sacred ground, to bury them, not hide them, to return them to the soil with prayer, humility, and faith. In doing so, families began to feel a shift, lightness returning, peace descending, a spiritual stillness finally settling over the home. It was not magic, but obedience to grace. The mistake of retaining ashes was not made out of rebellion, but out of love misdirected. But even love must bow before truth. And in truth, the human body, no matter how reduced to ash, is not an ornament. It is not memory. It is mystery. It belongs to God. And when the living remember this and return the dust to the earth in faith, the door to deeper peace opens again. And what once invited sorrow becomes instead a quiet surrender to the hope of resurrection. There came a moment, often after the tears had dried and the silence of absence grew louder, when the soul longed, not for more answers but for restoration. In the lives of those affected by the hidden wounds of improper mourning, the urn left too long in the home, the ashes scattered without prayer, the final rites forgotten in the name of convenience, there existed a thread of spiritual imbalance that they could not name but always felt. And it was in this fragile space between confusion and repentance that a quiet gift was offered, the return of grace through prayer. Padre Pio, with his profound awareness of the unseen world, never shamed those who came burdened with this invisible grief. He knew that many did what they did out of desperation, out of fear of forgetting their loved ones or being forgotten themselves. But he also knew that healing required action. And that action, more often than not, began not with moving ashes or scheduling rituals, but with words, simple, humble, surrendered words. A prayer, not just any prayer, but one shaped by truth, love, and obedience to the sacred order of things. He taught that true reparation begins when the heart acknowledges that something sacred has been mishandled, even unintentionally. The prayer he gave was not complex. It was whispered, often kneeling, hands trembling, eyes wet. It asked for mercy, not just for the soul of the departed, but for the living who had unknowingly disturbed the delicate fabric of grace. It invited heaven to step back into the space where it had been edged out. It went something like this: Lord, what I have held too tightly, I now release. What I have tried to preserve in my own strength, I return to you. May the soul of my loved one find rest in your arms, and may my home be renewed in your peace. Those who prayed it didn't always feel something at first. Sometimes the peace came slowly, like morning light. Sometimes it came suddenly, like a gust of wind that clears away a suffocating fog. But it came, and with it came a reordering of the heart. Pictures on mantles remained, but their presence no longer hurt. Birthdays and anniversaries passed with reverence, not despair, and the home, once heavy, felt light again, alive with a quiet holiness that had been absent for too long. Sister Lucia, though known more for her visions than her words, had also left behind a pattern of prayer for such spiritual disorders. In her later letters, rarely published, she wrote that the greatest act of love we can offer the dead is to commend them fully to God, to hold on to them in memory but not in possession, and that by lifting their names in prayer, especially the Rosary, especially during the month of the Holy Souls, we not only aid them but also allow our hearts to be reawakened to eternal hope. There were also prayers of reparation, small, whispered acts that reversed spiritual damage, lighting a candle in church, offering a mass, placing the name of the departed in a book of intentions. These were not superstitions, they were bridges between the seen and unseen, between the sorrow of loss and the promise of resurrection. Each prayer, each offering, became like a brick laid upon sacred ground, slowly rebuilding what grief and error had shaken. One widow, who had kept her husband's ashes in her bedroom for 5 years, finally approached a priest for guidance, after watching a video about Padre Pio's warnings. With the priest's help, she arranged for a quiet burial. That evening, she prayed the prayer Padre Pio had taught. She expected to feel guilt or sorrow. Instead, she said, "It was as if I could finally breathe again." The air in her home felt different. Her dreams changed. And for the first time in years, she slept without waking in the early hours, heavy with sadness. It wasn't just the ritual that brought change. It was the surrender, the letting go not of memory, but of control. And this is what Padre Pio and Sister Lucia had always pointed toward, that grace flows where obedience opens the way, that when the heart bows in reverent prayer, even after mistakes have been made, heaven rushes in, not with judgment, but with mercy. So this final chapter was never about condemnation. It was about return. Return to prayer. Return to grace. Return to the truth that death is not the end, and that every soul, living or departed, is held in the sacred tension between justice and mercy. And it is prayer that tips the scale toward light. Always prayer, always love, always God.